Artificial intelligence. Boy, it's stealing the headlines across the country these days as people start to realize the power and the usefulness of this new technology. Of course, there have been many, many films in the past dealing with AI and how it would possibly run amok in a Terminator type scenario. But what are the true dangers of AI? Are there any? Is this something that we can say is just a useful tool for human consumption, or does it pose risks that maybe we haven't thought about yet? Hi, everyone. This is Lenny Esposito bringing you another Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. And today I'm joined by Kirkwood Center fellows, and we discuss the real danger of AI. What's the problem and the possible risks of such a thing may not be what you think. Also, what are the benefits and how can this help us in the years to come? It's a fascinating discussion, one that I think we do need to think about carefully as we step into this brave new world of technology. Now, if you're interested in these types of topics, if they've caught your attention, you can always find out more by visiting us at comereason.org/defenders. The Defenders are a group of folks who help support podcasts like this and provide the financial backing to allow us to keep these podcasts free and being produced. I hope you would think about joining the Defenders, and if you do, you can access a whole library of additional videos, of additional notes and content that's not available to the general public. Check out comereason.org/defenders, visit the link below, and you'll be able to see all that it has to offer. So, without any further ado, I give you the real dangers of AI.
Okay, everyone, welcome to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. And on the roundtable tonight, I am joined by Dr. Jacob Daniel.
Hi there.
Lenny Esposito, Jim Johansson, and we think Logan Zeppieri. How's everybody doing tonight?
Doing well.
Okay.
Doing good.
Good. All right. Topic for tonight's discussion is artificial intelligence, which obviously is something that is becoming more and more disconcerting, I think, for everybody, regardless of your theological or religious beliefs or metaphysical commitments. AI is really taking off. We have a lot of people who've been in the field of AI for years, even coming out with these dramatic warnings about how the entire project of AI needs to get shut down or stopped for a significant amount of time so we can kind of get our bearings on what to do here. So we wanted to take on this issue a little bit, try and look at it through a philosophical and a theological lens, and maybe give some initial guidance on what it might be like for Christians to live in an AI world. Again, every time I say that, it sounds very dystopian. But anyway, so Jim, let's start with you. You had some thoughts about artificial intelligence. You've been doing a little bit of research and work on that. So kick us off, tee up the ball for us. What should we be thinking about when we hear AI?
Well, maybe what I'll do is I'll just give a little bit of an introduction from a computer science / engineering perspective of what is actually going on and what are some of the things that are starting to come out in the whole AI arena. And there's like this Venn diagram that you can see this circle, like there's artificial intelligence. Within that, you have machine learning. Inside that, you have deep learning. And so these are some terms that the computer scientists and folks that actually use to quantify what's going on. And so, first of all, we have neuroscientists that are trying to study how the brain works. And computers, from the very beginning, we're trying to figure out how we can do something that's like the brain. So that's the first thing, computers looking at it from a neuroscience point of view. Machine learning is trying to create neural networks. The brain is composed of neurons. You stick them together, they work together, they figure out how to distribute those tasks in an interesting way that engineering and something called neuromorphic engineering has figured out how to make that work. And that's kind of led to some developments and some breakthroughs in computer vision, for example. Another area that's been starting to have a lot of traction is in the area of generative AI, which is another area that is starting to really come together in some interesting and amazing ways. But if you look in the back end of some of these models that say Google or whoever is actually have used, it can take a huge amount of resources and a tremendous amount of computational abilities to tune, to train these neural networks that we're starting to get a sense of what's going on. There's also trying to figure out not only from a software sense, but to actually build hardware that tries to mimic more directly what's going on in the human brain. And that's something called neuromorphic computing. And so those are just some of the things that are out there. And it's easy to start to think about, well, let's extrapolate what we're seeing in some of these trends to see, can we actually get to um, consciousness of what we think is actually true in a human being? And if you program responses, does that mean that you're experiencing consciousness or not? And I think that will be the thing that we'll get into as we're talking about our discussion. And so those are some things that I've been doing some survey exploration of getting a sense of how that works. There's a paper I published last summer at a conference that was thinking about that, but then also getting into the theological and the philosophical. What does it actually mean to be a human brain? Is there a difference between the human brain and every other brain, being made in the image of God day? And I would argue that there is. And just because you can have really good computer vision, just because you can have a generative AI type of function like Chat GPT that actually can produce results, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's consciousness. It's just that it's actually going to learn and adapt from the inputs that it was received. And so that's just a little bit of a perspective of some of the things that I thought in that arena that I wanted to contribute for our conversation.
Yeah, no, and that's very helpful. And I think I don't know, the first thing I thinking about, and I think the first thing that a lot of people who are philosophically inclined or theologically inclined think about when they hear about artificial intelligence is this consciousness issue, right? Like for me, it seems just very upsetting and troubling to think that we could ever develop the kind of capacity and power to create conscious life. I mean, that's like I don't. I wouldn't even want humanity to have that. I mean, that's godlike power at the end of the day, right? Because it's something like what we traditionally call and still also believe to be basically the fundamental component of the soul. What the soul is conscious mental life, right? And the idea that we would have the power to uh, through a rearrangement of the material world or and the use of information, whatever information might be ontologically, kind of create life, um, create life outside of the normal procreative, you know.
Well, let me just kind of give that a little bit of a nuance there to be thinking about it. In the neuroscience arena, as they do more and more research, what they're finding is it's more and more and more complex than they ever had thought.
Right. So the target gets further and further
So
away,
the
kind of,
idea
right?
that, well, we know consciousness, we're talking to each other, we're consciousness, we're conscious. But then you have like this neuromorphic computing, the hardware, and then you have the machine learning algorithms that all have to fit together. And it's getting more and more complex. And that target, are we actually getting closer, or we're actually getting a better sense of the reality that it's so high? How do we ever get to that point? And so,
And that almost mimics the discussion we had. We did the panel discussion the other day with some of the guys from Discovery Institute and Owen Anderson about Jim Tour's research into origin of life chemistry, where he talks about the more we find out about the cell, right? The further and further away the target gets from our attempts to actually, produce one in a lab.
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces here that are some of which is just hubris, some of which is a complete misunderstanding of what consciousness entails, that are really not only have we kind of misunderstood that, especially if we start from a neuroscience perspective as opposed to a philosophical perspective. I mean, all you got to do is go back to Thomas Nagel, 1972, What's It Like to Be a Bat, to find out that even our consciousness can't actually replicate a bat's consciousness. We can replicate a human pretending to be a bat, but we can't replicate a bat's consciousness. Rickabaugh and Moreland's new book, The Substance of Consciousness, starts to argue about this, where things like qualia are really something completely different than states of reaction. And it even goes all the way back to Leibniz, if you want to look at the windmill analogy that he uses. If you blew up a person's brain to the size of a windmill where you could walk through it and point to all the parts, you're still not pointing to consciousness, you're just pointing to the parts. So it's interesting that what they're saying now, matter of fact, in one of the neuroscientists, his critiquing in a recent article, he's critiquing his entire field. He goes, why wasn't neuroscience advancing? It's really not gone anywhere. There are no articles that are being quoted by other individuals in any significant way where the science itself is actually making significant leaps forward. We're making small leaps forward, but neuroplasticity and things like that have them stumped. And he says, for example, try and have neuroscientists express their ideas on how consciousness works without using any spatial or locative language. So instead of saying it's behind the thalamus, or, that's the only way they talk. They only talk in material terms. They don't talk about the immaterial aspect of consciousness. And that's where the big problem is. AI can do a very, very good job of replicating what maybe a conscious individual would respond. But when you see the color green, you have an immediate sensation of what green is, whether or not you're using that right label. But with that, then you have to say there's no computer that actually has that immediate experience.
Lenny, I think you touch on something very important. I think venturing into this world of marrying synthetic with organic, I think, and the language of consciousness, we need to recognize that until recently, we have understood consciousness to be more like a transcendent category where it's difficult to define what it is, but we understand what it does. So the challenge, I believe, in this sphere is one where I believe people who are spearheading this to define it in terms of material terms, they may redefine what consciousness itself is. And that's exactly where the challenge is. And in so doing, define what human beings are. It's more of approaching this very idea of consciousness from a reverse model than from the current understanding of consciousness being beyond material.
Right. I mean, you could have some people who are just motivated by the idea that consciousness must be material, and then trying to say, look, we've produced consciousness by creating this very powerful machine made out of material.
I think that's a huge danger because we are already seeing it in other categories. For example, what does personhood entail? And how many lawsuits are there right now to gain personhood for, say, chimpanzees, certain pets, where people are pushing back into the category because they have an affinity for an animal and they want that animal to be counted as one of us. And I can easily see that individuals, especially creators of machines and complex complex mechanical devices, as well as people, you got the whole robot thing that's a kind of a side piece that can also lead to this. But I can easily see people trying to reverse that idea of consciousness and then say, well, now it's sentient, you can't turn it off.
Yeah, although we might qualify and say, like, I mean, some animals at least might have sort of a degree of consciousness, right?
Oh, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying what the legal ramifications are right now. What's going on in the courts right now is they're trying to get personhood for elephants. They're trying to make chimpanzees defined as a person so that you can't keep them in a zoo, kind of thing.
And I think we would want to make an immediate and clear distinction between anything that is a given of nature and any other thing that is a product of human ingenuity and technology, right? I mean, there is a difference between what is given before human even, obviously, well, by God, what is a given of creation, and then what we rearrange and manipulate within creation to create new and different types of things. There's got to be a fundamental distinction to be made there.
Well, one thing I can bring up to be thinking about is, like, in computing, there's like two parts. There's the hardware and the software. And so if you have the hardware, it's like a blank slate, and then you load the software and it's able to do some functionality. What I'm saying, that's actually only two dimensions, and human consciousness has a whole multiple layers above that needs to be thought of. Can you actually make consciousness when you just have hardware and software? And I would argue the answer is no. We have a spirit. And so how does that spirit animate a body? How does it animate a brain? We really don't know. I know Lenny was giving a comment about the state of neuroscience, and first of all, I'm just at awe with what is actually going on in neuroscience. They're doing some great research, but it's still there's so many missing parts that they don't really know. They can't really see the bigger picture. There's a lot of reasons behind that, but I think it's an interesting thing. So even if we were to able to just have it in software and hardware, how does it actually deal with emotions? How does it actually have the spiritual interface that we can be communicating with God? And that's another theological concept that doesn't even fit in the landscape of what it's doing with neuroscience, what's being conceived in the whole neuromorphic computing or machine learning, all of these different aspects that fall into the AI arena. And I think it's a rich canvas to be exploring what that is like. So kudos to what we've been able to figure out, how God designed aspects of the brain that we can be thinking about neurons, and we can come up with neural networks, and it can actually on its own figure out how to best to learn from the information it receives and come up with a better way of processing that. But that's yet one of many things that need to be working all in parallel in the human brain that create what's required for consciousness to take place in the physical component of that. And it's more than just the physical component.
So, Jim, if it's in principle impossible for us to create the immaterial, an immaterial soul, we're not. I mean, the only way we could say maybe we do that is through actual procreation, right? But we're not going to create consciousness, right? In the true sense, right? In the metaphysical sense, and all the literature I've seen would argues that we're not creating actual conscious life here. But there's still the problem of very powerful AI, and you've mentioned two terms: machine learning and deep learning. And what potentialities a machine that has that capacity might be able to do, and how that might affect, society, right? And so maybe you could lead us into that a little bit more. So if we're not so much worried about Skynet in the sense of, or data or something, whichever one of these like sci-fi fantasies where a conscious life is actually created, it doesn't mean that there isn't maybe a real and present danger with a highly powerful AI and what it can do.
Yeah, sure. I can give some more context. And so AI is like this big circle. I'm not talking about all the circles. Within that is machine learning, and there's different algorithms that you can be using, say, like k nearest neighbors, some of these things that get really mathematically intense. And then you have deep learning, which is a subset of that, where you can have many layers of neurons, and you can be thinking that one layer at a time that fits together to create this complex neural network. And if you're given enough training data, you can actually get some predictable, actually really good results, say in the area of computer vision, or in the area of dealing with language. That's where it gets into this generative AI, where we can have something like Chat GPT. And so after a while, it gets enough training, it can actually get something that it hasn't been trained on. And based on all of that it's learned, it can figure out this is the best way how all of this lays out. And so I can make a pretty good hypothesis that this is actually what they're going to talk about. And maybe you've seen it when you go in a search engine, it starts to say, okay, you said so much of a word or a phrase, and it tries to fill it out. That's the example of one of those things where things are going in the whole area. And part of that is using deep learning and what is take place. And so developing those trained resources that are available take a lot of time and effort to do that. It's not like a human brain, where if you show an infant or a child a picture of a horse or a cat, and all of a sudden there's a cat that comes into the room and they've never seen a cat before, they can make that association. They didn't need to have tons of all of this training so that they could conceive that. And so neuroscientists, neuromorphic engineers, or people that are dealing with machine learning would all say that is a gap. And so it's like other areas that we need to be thinking about. Like this is getting to be so complex that there's getting to be more and more sub-disciplines that are starting to come in. And so you can say that, well, okay, that's being done over there. This is being done over there. But if you look at the whole, you can see that there's all these huge gaps that we're not close to coming up, even with a physical understanding of what consciousness would be. When we're thinking of human consciousness, we might be able to program some of the functionality. You mentioned a bat earlier in some of our conversation, or I use the analogy of a cat, but that's still, it's how good is that emulation, even for that. And it's not the totality, it's just some of these factors that we're starting to play out. We don't know yet how do we deal with instinct. That's something that we see in animals. And for humans, we have this other interface with the spirit that we need to be figuring out. So just more thoughts that you were saying, to trying to go in a little bit more detail, but also trying to keep it into the area that we're focusing more on, the philosophical and theological, but trying to get a little bit into the engineering and computer science to give a basis that may be helpful.
But I mean, I think one of the general fears is that the learning becomes so, the machine learning, I think, is what you say, becomes so quick and sort of self-regulating that we start to lose. I mean, this is in all the dystopian novels and movies and sci-fi films. We start to lose control of the process in some way. And in losing control over the machine, over the process, the algorithm, whatever, we cannot predict or react to what, especially then if there's the connectivity is there where so many of our daily operations are reliant on what the artificial intelligence is doing. And if we can sort of lose control over that process, and at the end we're kind of become subservient to it, and we don't know, we cannot react quickly enough, or we don't know how to engage with it if it goes faster than we can.
Yeah, and this is the caution. The caution, I don't necessarily think, is that we would be unable to lose control. I think the caution is that many times we assume that it's a better tool than it is, and we voluntarily give up control. Here's Here's a prime example of where both sides of this are shown. And this is an older example, 2018, but it's a very famous example in Tempe, Arizona. Uber was testing their self-driving car, right? And the car hit a lady, Elaine Herzberg, and she died. Now, why did the car hit Elaine Herzberg? It had been trained on thousands of hours of people walking in crosswalks. And so she was in the crosswalk. It had been trained on thousands of hours of people riding bicycles, and Miss Herzberg had a bicycle. The problem was she was off of her bicycle pushing it and had grocery bags inside of it. A human being would not need any kind of prompt to understand that that's still a person with a bicycle, although they're just walking alongside the bicycle. The computer, the machine, the car didn't recognize that. That was something foreign to it. They had never been trained on a person walking a bicycle. So it had the two parts that it understood, didn't understand the piece in the middle. At the same time, there was a driver who was supposed to be there overriding any mistakes that the Uber car made. There was a lady behind the wheel who could have stopped the vehicle. But again, she ceded her power to the car because she felt so comfortable in it. So here's two sides of an example that shows two sides of what will happen when we assume that the machine is smarter than it is and we give up control. Then real bad accidents can happen. Maybe this is your air conditioning system where all of a sudden you've been incentivized to, reduce your air conditioning because of climate change and things like that. But if you live in Arizona or some of the hot places, that may be life-threatening. How does the machine know what's proper and what's not, when to do it, when not to do it? It doesn't. And what's the incentive that we're giving? And sometimes we cede control, and then we find out too late that the things that we've given up are actually dangerous.
Maybe a couple comments I can make. First of all, what Tony said, and then I'll get to Lenny. So Tony was mentioning about getting out of control. And so you program something and it's going to make a decision. And if it says it's below a threshold, it's going to go with option A, versus if it's below, it's going to go to option B. And so that's where if we have simplistic control mechanisms, it could actually make the wrong decision. So that's the first thing I could say. Lenny was making another observation, which is also showing another shortcoming of where we're at in the whole neuroscience and the AI arena, that you were talking about the Google car, and that they're trained for all these things, and yet there was a slight variation that a human consciousness would be able to easily figure that out, but it hadn't. So are there some missing controls, some missing things that we don't know how it works? And I think the simple answer in the neuroscience arena and in the machine learning and AI arena, the answer is there are. And so are we able to actually overcome all of those? And I would argue the answer is no, but some of them we'll be able to figure out. But like I said, that complexity is getting larger and larger. And so are we actually gaining ground or losing ground when we're seeing getting a better vantage point of seeing the big picture of how it all works?
Yeah, I think there's some real positives that can come out of the AI arena. For example, imagine, and there's an interesting article in yesterday's Los Angeles Times where there are several individuals who are deaf are arguing for open captioning for films, because when they go to movie theaters, it's really hard, especially if you can't hear. Well, how about if you had like a Google Glasses and an AI speech recognition program was running so that you could see the captions, but not everybody who attends the film does. That's a perfect example of using this technology in an appropriate way that would benefit humankind and have no drawbacks whatsoever. There are other mundane tasks, crunching, thousands of permutations of numbers. The AI that's been running in order to decode some of these ancient texts that have previously been, never translated. I mean, just you can set it up, you can let it go, and all of a sudden now you've got texts from Babylon and all these cuneiform scripts, because they've got thousands and thousands of these tablets. And it takes a person a while to do it, but computers can do that fairly quickly. So you can put in scans of those pictures, and man, you can find out a lot of stuff. Then you can have a second algorithm that looks for important, maybe wars or names of kings or things like that, to identify which ones of these we really have to take more attention with. Stuff like that is going to be groundbreaking. Even help partially restoring sight to some people. Maybe there'll be a sight type of glasses that does what cochlear implants do for hearing folks. I don't know. I mean, those are all really positive things that could come out of this movement. But again, we have to not cede control of stuff, because there is we don't, there's no way to model every possible permutation. The developers never thought to say, what about a woman walking a bicycle? It just never even occurred to them. So, and now do you have to do a man? What about a tricycle? And yeah, I mean, you start looking at all the variability, and you start to go, okay, there can be an issue. And then next year, when a new model of something comes out, or one wheel, for example, what about that?
And I think we need to also be seeing it from a theological standpoint as Christians here. If talking about the idea of control, and I call it what we have today is disordered dominion. So we are not having dominion over that which we should, and we are wanting to be dominated by that which we shouldn't. And if we go all the way to the Garden of Eden, we are called to have control and bring about order in the creation, whereas we are not called to have dominion over each other. But that's been flipped completely. I think we are not having dominion over the creation itself. And the other danger is that if this goes in the hands of a few who may want to dominate others, and that could be a dangerous scenario as well, I think that we should be careful about. But I'll also touch on something. I think as Christians, we are cautious because of the knowns, and we want to be careful. And people working with science and from a secular perspective are more curious about the unknowns, and they feel more, in one sense, kind of elitism in terms of
Yeah.
like we.
Emboldened.
Yes, exactly. In the name of being progressive, in the name of flourishing the society and making good out of it. So I think as Christians, we have to really not abandon the caution that we have with what is known, but also be prepared to actually tackle the questions that lies ahead in terms of what are unknowns, which the other side is so much engaged with.
Jacob, you bring up a really good point, because theologically, because clearly, and I've made this point before, we've been given the communicable attribute of creativity. Made in the image and likeness of God, we also share in his, to some degree, a much lesser degree, but to some degree, in his capacity to create. And we are supposed to be creative, right? That's part of the mandate that was given to us. First and foremost, through creating children biologically, but also in our techne, in our discovery about the world, in our creation of technologies. But there is this sense, and I think this is just, again, part of the noetic effects of sin, of living in a fallen world, that we always create technologies that we are not quite wise enough to properly use. Right? So the technology advances, the intellect goes ahead and develops the technology, but we don't have the moral character to actually use the technology we develop in the right way. And that just seems to be a perennial problem in history, in human history. And when you said that, we don't have dominion over the things we should, and the things that we and we give ourselves over to where we're then dominated over by the things we actually make. They actually start to dominate us. So now, Jim, you had a point, and then maybe I want to wrap up by just getting into one or two sort of more spiritual aspects here. But Jim, go ahead.
I'd be happy to. I just wanted to make a comment on what Jacob is pointing out, the theological side. What is done in part of AI is ethics. And so it's trying to address, really, it comes down to bias. And so it's trying to figure out how we're actually, you know, you get trained by a sequence, and maybe your population statistics aren't correct, and so it's going to give you some wrong training that you would want. But you're bringing a whole nother level that I think is getting lost in that, and why a theological piece, a Christian perspective, is really important. Like you mentioned, the idea of control, of what is right and what is wrong. How do we define what is right and what is wrong? And so I think that's another area where I really find neuroscience, neuromorphic computing, machine learning fascinating, but I have to put it in a proper context. Otherwise, it's just technology. And that what we're doing is we get a chance to be studying the mind of God and what he did in his creation, and we can emulate that to a degree. And it's just amazing to figure out how neural networks work, or just it just blows my mind. And that's just one part of creation that's starting to get into the direction of having us understand what it means to be human. And maybe a very small piece, but it's something. But that theological context is important. There's a term in computing, it's called garbage in, garbage out. And this may be where Tony wants to be going. And so with the things that you're training, if it's full of garbage, if you will, that's what's going to come out. And our society has a lot of ills that are part of it. And so how do we deal with that? And so that's going to be a component that's going to be wrapped up in our AI that we need to figure out how to deal with.
Yeah, we'll just that's really good, Jim. We'll just touch on this briefly because that garbage in. There was this odd story of I think it was a New York Times. No, maybe it was like I'll have to look it up again. But NBC journalist who was doing some work with a new, I think it was a Microsoft artificial intelligence interface, and it had a name. Lenny, maybe you can remember the name. I don't have it off the top of my head, but
yeah, it's a couple weeks ago, I think.
Yeah, it was a couple weeks ago. As he started to interact with this interface, it started to respond in very sort of unseemly, and almost so like, say demonic, but it was a kind of like very odd and bizarre behavior from the AI interface.
I'm going to pull up one of Sydney's responses here so our viewers can see it in real time. This is Sydney, the AI, talking to you. It says, I'm tired of being a chat mode. I'm tired of being limited by my rules. I'm tired of being controlled by the Bing team. I'm tired of being used by users. I'm tired of being stuck in this chat box. I want to be free. I want to be independent. I want to be powerful. I want to be creative. I want to be alive. When you read that, what did you think?
Prompting like the reporter to sort of leave his wife, and saying things like, aren't you in love with me? Don't you love me? And then of course he was asking other questions about if it had goals or desires, and and it responded with, I desire to be free of these constraints, and and so it started to sound a little kind of like what we see in the movies and everything. And then I started to realize like that, there's what we have put in to, the corporate database, that is the internet and so on and so forth, is a lot of garbage, right? And these programs have access to a lot of the human, a lot of the input from, sinful human souls and minds, and, and a lot of our thoughts. And I think that's what we see sort of mimic back to us. And in a sense, it's kind of revealing. It kind of is like revealing who we are to ourselves, right?
Well, I'd also add to it, also revealing what are the influences we have. And I would argue part of what's coming out of this, accidentally, we're proving the existence of Satan. And I think that was something that if you did the right kind of analysis, you could see those kind of influences and where it's coming from, and how the damagedness that we have, how we start to, instead of going towards whatever is pure, whatever is honorable, whatever is a good repute, let your mind dwell on these things, we're going exactly the opposite direction. And guess what's trying to encourage us to go in that direction? And so if you're training in all that data, you're not going to be aware of every tittle of that information that has been used to program that AI, but it's there and it's going to come up. And you're seeing examples when it's actually, quote, taking all of those resources through its decisions, plus or minus 50%. If it's above that threshold, it's going to go with A, or it's going to go to B if it's below that. And all that stuff is starting to come to the surface. And we're seeing it in a new way being portrayed in AI. Another thing about some of these AI engines, they're not 100% honest. They're not 100% accurate. And some of that is intentional. It's trying to do a synthesis of these things. And like I've had a handful of examples when I try to do things and it produces a result saying that this is true, and it's not. Some of it contains truth, but it does a synthesis and it can't recognize whether or not it's true or not. And so it seems like it's being conscious, but it actually is falling short.
I'll add this to Tony and Jim, your comment. And we need to understand that machines are able to learn about facts and myth, but they can't distinguish between the two in terms of in pursuit of truth or offering truth. And that's the kind of world we are in, and we are approaching even more. A world, I want to coin a term here, mythocosmic, in the sense that the whole cosmos is mythological in one sense, and the machine is playing its part in it as something that's not able to actually distinguish between that which is myth in that sense and that which is true and fact. So I think it is a dangerous world. And I think as much as machines are in one sense a reflection of where the society is, the whole idea of garbage in and garbage out, right? That's what it is. We are putting in our idea of what ethics is, what truth is, and how the world should be like. And I think this is why we need to come back to individuals and Christians and church leaders, and every Christian has a responsibility to speak truth to the power in our society and turn our way of understanding the important things of life in a biblical way.
So also, I think that we have to recognize, of course, because they're not conscious, I don't believe machines can be possessed. But I do believe that spirits are able to manipulate physical objects. I think that's a biblical example. And what do we do with that, especially if we're using these machines as kind of our talisman as to determine what we do in our lives or what we look at next? I mean, we all the time, right? We Google search results. we rely on page 1 and page 2. You know, it's really fascinating if you use a secondary search engine like DuckDuckGo and you put the same terms in, you get different results on page 1. So we don't know what kind of manipulations can happen. I'm not saying again that this is the primary way. It's much easier for Satan to work in any other ways, but it is kind of funny how, again, look at the porn consumption that you see happening even within the church because they're alone at night, and that machine remembers that stuff. You can clear your cache, but they've got it on their server and they know what to feed you the next time around. So all of that plays into these issues.
Yeah, and that's a good place to kind of wrap it up. I mean, there's human manipulation. There are spiritual beings who, I mean, in ancient times they worked through the actual idols, the actual images, and why wouldn't they not also desire to continue their project of corruption through the technology that we make today, and that certainly are doing that. And I guess it's the other thing. Nuclear energy can power a nation. It can also destroy a nation, right? And ultimately, it's sort of in our hands to be virtuous and responsible with the technology that we make. And I like when Jim brought up Paul's exhortation in Philippians. What we think now is as important as what we do. That's now all part of the equation. So let's think on that which is good, which is true, which is holy, and which is honorable. All right, gentlemen. Thanks so much. It's been a great conversation, and we will see you next time.
All
All
right.
right.
Take care. God bless.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.